They said she walked into the church draped not in silk, not in lace, not in the colors of youth and promise, but in the pale, fragile fabric that had once embraced death. Imagine the silence of that moment, the stunned eyes of villagers watching a bride move forward, her veil nothing less than her mother's burial shroud. Each step echoed like a tolling bell. Each whisper followed like a shadow. Why wear death to a wedding? What vow could possibly demand such defiance? Some claimed it was superstition, a charm to protect her womb from the grave that waited behind every childbirth. Others whispered it was madness, a curse wrapped in cloth, a cruel inheritance passed from the dead to the living. But one truth pulsed beneath the unease. This was not mere clothing. This was armor against mortality itself. What kind of world forces joy to dress in the fabric of sorrow? To understand the strangeness of this ritual, we must descend into the darkness of the medieval world, where every birth was a negotiation with death, and every woman who dared to bring forth life risked surrendering her own. Childbirth was no private pain, it was a battlefield, one where the body itself betrayed, where fever, blood, and silence claimed mothers without warning. In that world, even love itself bent before fear. What use was a crown of flowers if death was already waiting by the marriage bed? Better, perhaps, to invite it in, to wear its cloth openly, and pray it would be appeased. Think of the shroud itself. It is no ordinary fabric. It carries memory, of skin once stilled, of breath once gone. To wrap oneself in it is to carry not only the weight of linen but of mortality itself, pressed against the heart. The bride who wore her mother's shroud carried more than thread and cloth. She carried the shadow of the grave into the one day that was meant to celebrate the promise of tomorrow. That is why the story lingers, centuries later, etched into folklore, whispered as both horror and lesson. But ask yourself, was she protected or condemned? Did the shroud truly shield her from death, or did it bind her more closely to it? Here, history begins to blur with myth. In some tellings, she survived, her children living proof that death had been cheated. In others, the cloth proved prophetic, her life was cut short, her body laid out in the very fabric she once wore to ward off fate. Perhaps that is why we still return to this tale, because it refuses to resolve, it forces us to sit in the tension between survival and surrender. Yet the image of the shrouded bride was not isolated. Across medieval Europe, symbols of mortality were woven into rituals of love and union. Weddings and funerals mirrored each other more closely than we would imagine today. Bells that rang for joy also tolled for grief. Priests who blessed the union of flesh also buried it when flesh gave way to silence. And so, for those who lived in a world where every heartbeat was fragile, the presence of death was not taboo. It was constant. The shroud on a wedding day was not a contradiction. It was truth. Still, there is something uniquely haunting about this particular act. A mother's shroud passed down to her daughter. What whispers might have passed with it? Was it a warning? A gift? A plea to remember her? Imagine the daughter unfolding that cloth, still faintly marked with the scent of incense, the dust of earth, the faint trace of skin that had once lived. To wear it was to walk in her mother's shadow, to carry not only the memory of her death, but also her hope that the daughter might live. The fabric became a covenant across generations, between those lost and those yet to be born. The medieval world was built on such covenants. Superstition was not idle fancy, it was survival strategy. With medicine crude and unreliable, people turned to symbols, relics, charms. A piece of cloth could hold more power than a physician's hand. A whispered prayer could weigh more heavily than an apothecary's draft. When faced with forces they could not control, people stitched their fears into fabric, carved them into wood, carried them in pockets close to their skin. The shroud was one of these objects, a talisman born not of imagination alone but of desperation. Why desperation? Because childbirth was the terror no woman could escape. Records from the medieval world speak with grim clarity. Mortality in childbirth was as common as celebration. Whole villages had seen brides buried within months of marriage. Fathers lost daughters, children lost mothers, husbands lost wives, and the cycle repeated with merciless regularity. In such a world, to marry was to stand at a crossroads. One path led to life, the other to silence. And every woman knew she might be forced to walk the darker road. Think of the psychology of that fear. Imagine a society where young women grew up watching mothers, sisters, and neighbors carried out on stretchers, the cries of labor ending in the stillness of death. Each birth became not only a moment of joy but also a public gamble with mortality. Is it any wonder that families sought ways to bargain, to ward off fate, to dress their daughters not only for love but for survival? The burial shroud was not only fabric, it was a petition, a shield, a desperate gamble against the odds. And so the image of that bride walking forward is more than curiosity. It is a window into the soul of a world where faith and fear were bound so tightly that they became indistinguishable. She is not only a bride, she is every woman who ever walked toward marriage knowing death might already be seated at the feast. But linger with her a moment longer. Picture her hands, clutching fabric that once touched her mother's skin. Picture the pale folds against her face, the way her breath might have warmed the threads once cold with earth. Did she believe in the power of that cloth? Did she feel safer, or did the weight of it press terror deeper into her bones? Did the guests watching her feel awe, or did they sense they were witnessing something uncanny, something that should not be? The silence in that church was not reverence, it was dread. For what greater symbol of paradox could there be than this? A shroud meant for the grave now walking toward life. A mother's death now cradling her daughter's future. The ritual meant to ward off mortality standing as proof of its inevitability. It is in these paradoxes that medieval life unfolded, where opposites did not cancel but coexisted, bound together like the warp and weft of the shroud itself. And perhaps that is why this story refuses to fade. Because even today, when childbirth no longer claims lives as it once did, we remain haunted by mortality's presence in our most intimate moments. Weddings still promise forever, even though forever is a word death mocks. Love still dreams of immortality, even though the body will betray. And though we may not wear shrouds at our ceremonies, we carry them in other ways. Fear, denial, rituals that try to keep death at bay while acknowledging it waits for us all. The bride in her shroud becomes not only a figure from the past, but a mirror for the present. Her story asks us, what lengths will we go to escape the inevitable? What symbols will we wrap around ourselves to pretend we can bargain with fate? And in the end, when death still comes, what comfort will those symbols give us? This is not just a tale of one wedding, one woman, one cloth. It is the tale of humanity itself, locked in endless struggle with the fragility of life, reaching for meaning in objects, prayers, and rituals. In every town, in every parish, there were graves that held not only mothers but infants, the promise of generations extinguished in a single night. What silk veil could conceal such dread? What prayer could silence it? Records from the period speak with brutal clarity. In some regions, 1 out of every 3 women would die as a result of childbirth. In others, the numbers varied but the fear remained the same. Even the wealthiest were not spared. Queens, noblewomen, peasant girls, all were subject to the same dice roll of fate. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, buried child after child. Elizabeth of York, the mother of Henry VIII, died giving birth to her daughter. Noble blood carried no immunity, divine blessing offered no guarantee. Death in childbirth was democratic. It claimed without bias. And so, families created rituals. Some women wore relics tied to their bodies, saints' bones sewn into amulets, scraps of cloth believed to have touched holy shrines. Others drank bitter draughts made from herbs, pennyroyal, mugwort, rue, plants thought to ease labor but often poisonous in their own right. Midwives carried charms, whispered prayers, and practiced gestures meant to invite safe passage for both mother and child. The shroud worn by the bride in our story was only one form of this desperate tradition, to bargain with death by offering it symbols of respect, or by cloaking oneself in its fabric so that it might pass by. What does this tell us about their world? It reveals a society where fear was not hidden but enshrined, where terror became ritual, and where every household carried its private tragedies into public faith. To be born was itself a miracle. To survive infancy was a blessing. And for a mother to survive her own childbearing was sometimes seen as divine favor, as though God himself had intervened to grant mercy. But pause here. Ask yourself, what must it have felt like to live under this constant shadow? To grow up as a girl knowing your own body was both vessel of life and harbinger of death? The womb was sacred, but it was also treacherous. The same chamber that could carry the future of a family could just as easily become a tomb. For men, battlefields defined mortality. For women, mortality arrived in the chamber, in the blood and silence of birth. This was not seen as unusual, it was expected. And so, in the quiet acceptance of danger, entire cultures were shaped. This acceptance colored everything. Marriage contracts often contained clauses for inheritance should the bride die in childbirth. Families exchanged property and land with the full knowledge that their daughter might not live to enjoy them. Songs and prayers written for weddings sometimes carried double meanings, blessings for fertility, but also invocations of safety, pleas for protection. Joy was tempered with dread, celebration with caution. Behind every wedding feast lurked the awareness that the next gathering might be a funeral. What does this tell us about their world? It reveals a society where fear was not hidden but enshrined, where terror became ritual, and where every household carried its private tragedies into public faith. To be born was itself a miracle. To survive infancy was a blessing. And for a mother to survive her own childbearing was sometimes seen as divine favor, as though God himself had intervened to grant mercy. But pause here. Ask yourself, what must it have felt like to live under this constant shadow? To grow up as a girl knowing your own body was both vessel of life and harbinger of death? The womb was sacred, but it was also treacherous. The same chamber that could carry the future of a family could just as easily become a tomb. For men, battlefields defined mortality. For women, mortality arrived in the chamber, in the blood and silence of birth. This was not seen as unusual, it was expected. And so, in the quiet acceptance of danger, entire cultures were shaped. This acceptance colored everything. Marriage contracts often contained clauses for inheritance should the bride die in childbirth. Families exchanged property and land with the full knowledge that their daughter might not live to enjoy them. Songs and prayers written for weddings sometimes carried double meanings, blessings for fertility, but also invocations of safety, pleas for protection. Joy was tempered with dread, celebration with caution. Behind every wedding feast lurked the awareness that the next gathering might be a funeral. The paradox deepens when we consider how women were praised for their endurance, for their willingness to walk knowingly into this risk. To bear children despite the fear was seen as virtue, as courage, as piety. A woman who survived multiple childbirths was revered, her body likened to a fortress that had withstood countless sieges. Yet this reverence carried cruelty too, for it demanded sacrifice without offering real protection. Women were caught in a cycle they did not choose, and the only power they held was in rituals, prayers, and symbols like the shroud. There are chronicles of women who begged to be buried in their wedding clothes if they died in childbirth, binding love and death in the same garment. There are accounts of brides who sewed their own shrouds while still alive, preparing for the possibility that their marriage would lead them directly into the grave. In such a world, the act of wearing a mother's burial shroud was not madness but logic. If the mother had faced childbirth and lost, perhaps her cloth, infused with death, could carry some protective power for the daughter. If death had already claimed one, might it not be satisfied? Might it not pass the daughter by? There is philosophy buried in this ritual. It suggests a belief that death could be bargained with, that mortality had appetite and boundaries, that by acknowledging its power openly, one might deflect its gaze. To wear a shroud at a wedding was to say, "I know you wait for me, but I will meet you on my own terms." It was an act of both fear and defiance. But here is the darker thought: did these rituals comfort, or did they make fear heavier? To walk to your wedding dressed in the cloth of the grave may have offered protection, but it also carved mortality into every memory of that day. Every kiss, every promise, every glance at the bride would have been accompanied by the unspoken truth: she is already marked. She is already claimed. And if she lives, it will be in spite of the shroud, not because of it. This tension between comfort and curse is at the heart of medieval life. For the world they inhabited was not softened by denial. It was sharpened by constant reminders of fragility. Plagues swept through towns, wars reduced villages to ash, famine starved whole families, and childbirth silently drained the life from homes. Against such forces, people clung to anything they could control, even if it was only fabric, prayer, or gesture. To us, it may seem irrational. To them, it was survival. And survival was never guaranteed. In villages across Europe, registers note the eerie rhythm of life and death. Baptism followed by burial within days, marriages followed by widowing within months. Mothers carried infants to churches knowing they themselves might not return. Communities built their calendars not around seasons of abundance but around cycles of loss. And still, they endured. Still, they created rituals to soften the blow, to dress the terror in forms they could understand. The bride who wore her mother's burial shroud embodies this world. She is not a curiosity, not an anomaly. She is an expression of collective fear made visible, a symbol of the countless women whose stories did not survive in parchment or stone. We do not know her name, but she carries all names. We do not know her fate, but we know the fate of millions like her. And by remembering her, by dwelling in her image, we glimpse not only one woman's terror but an entire civilization's confrontation with the fragility of birth. And so, as we leave this second chapter of the story, we are drawn deeper into the paradox of life in the Middle Ages, that every joy carried grief, that every wedding carried the shadow of a funeral, and that to bring forth new life was to gamble with a life already given. The shroud, then, becomes more than cloth. It becomes the voice of a people saying, "We see death, we name it, we fear it, and still we move forward." The wedding chamber was never only a place of love. In the medieval world, it was a chamber haunted by silence, a stage where the vows of life could collapse into the reality of death. The very bed upon which a bride and groom first joined was also the bed upon which mothers labored, bled, and sometimes never rose again. In this paradox, joy and sorrow lay pressed together, and every marriage carried within it the shadow of a funeral. Imagine the chamber, stone walls lit by candles, the scent of rushes scattered on the floor, the heavy drapery drawn against the cold. The bride enters with the veil still clinging to her hair, the groom standing beside her, the household whispering prayers beyond the door. The world outside believes this is the consummation of union, the sacred moment of love's sealing. Yet within that room, another truth lingers: the marriage bed is already prepared to become a deathbed. The same sheets that will bear the joy of creation may soon soak the silence of departure. This is no exaggeration. Chronicles tell us of countless stories where the bride, radiant and celebrated on her wedding day, was carried out lifeless before a year had passed. In some cases, it was childbirth that claimed her. In others, fevers that followed, infections that no physician could cure. And so the chamber itself came to symbolize both hope and dread. To enter it was to step into uncertainty, to embrace love while bracing for mortality. Consider the haunting rhythm of these stories. A wedding feast, filled with song, dance and candlelight, followed within months by black cloth, tolling bells, and the procession of mourning. Guests who once toasted to the bride's health now carried torches for her burial. Priests who blessed the union now stood in the graveyard chanting prayers for the dead. In some villages, the same guests attended both events without changing seasons. Joy became grief without interruption. The memory of laughter clung bitterly to the echoes of lamentation. But why did these deaths so often follow marriage? The answer lies in the peril of childbirth, but also in the fragility of the body within that time. Women, weakened by constant pregnancies, poor nutrition, and the lack of medical care, bore the weight of mortality far heavier than men. Marriage, in its promise of heirs, became a path to danger. Every kiss carried within it the seed of risk. Every night together was a step toward a fate neither partner could control. And yet, they walked it willingly. They had no choice. The chamber, then, was a place of paradox. It was dressed with symbols of fertility, garlands of flowers, herbs meant to bless the union, talismans hung above the bedposts. But it was also shadowed by omens. Candles burned low as protection, prayers whispered in the corners, charms hidden in the sheets. Families prepared for both outcomes, though they spoke of only one. And when the worst came, the chamber was transformed. The bed that had cradled love now bore the weight of a corpse. The draperies that concealed tenderness now shielded death. We find echoes of this in songs and laments written during the era. Ballads speak of brides turned pale before their time, of husbands clutching infants as widowers, of beds gone cold before their warmth was known. These were not rare tragedies but common experiences, woven into the fabric of daily life. The chamber was both sanctuary and tomb. Every family understood this, though few dared to speak it aloud on the wedding night. There is a cruel poetry in this truth, that the most intimate space of love was also the most intimate space of loss. The marriage bed, meant to bring forth heirs, became the site where bloodlines ended. The chamber that was supposed to echo with laughter and the cries of infants often echoed instead with silence, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls like stone. To live in such a world was to carry constant awareness of fragility. To marry was to accept that death was already waiting, not in the far-off distance but in the very space meant for new beginnings. And so, communities built customs to soften the dread. Some covered the bed with holy relics, believing sacred cloth could shield the couple. Others anointed the chamber with holy water, driving out unseen spirits. In certain regions, women entered their first night of marriage carrying charms, tokens of mothers and grandmothers, symbols meant to protect the womb from what had claimed so many before. These rituals reveal the truth: the wedding chamber was never neutral. It was an arena of battle between life and death, hope and despair. Still, there remains something profoundly human in this paradox. For even as death loomed, people continued to marry, to love, to hope. They walked knowingly into danger, driven by desire, by faith, by duty to lineage. And in this courage, or perhaps resignation, we glimpse the essence of humanity itself, the willingness to risk all for the promise of connection, even when mortality is certain. Let us pause with one story. A chronicler in the 14th century wrote of a young noblewoman who, on the night of her wedding, asked to be left alone for a moment in the chamber. She knelt by the bed and whispered prayers, her hand pressed to a crucifix at her throat. "If this bed is to be my cradle or my coffin," she is said to have murmured, "let it be as God wills." Months later, she was dead in childbirth, her words remembered not as superstition but as prophecy. Such stories were not unusual. They were echoes repeated across the continent, reminders of the chamber's double face. The image of the bride wearing her mother's burial shroud becomes clearer in this light. She was not only walking toward the altar, she was walking toward the chamber, toward the risk that had consumed her mother before her. The shroud was preparation not only for vows but for what followed them. In wearing it, she admitted what everyone else avoided saying, that marriage was not only a covenant of love but a wager with death. Perhaps this is why the chamber haunted the imagination of poets and philosophers. They saw in it the perfect metaphor for existence itself. To enter life is to enter a chamber where joy and sorrow, love and loss, creation and destruction, lie together in the same bed. To live is to accept that every embrace is fragile, that every moment of laughter is shadowed by silence. The medieval mind did not turn away from this paradox. It stared into it and clothed it in ritual. And what of us? We no longer face the same mortal peril in childbirth, yet the chamber still holds its paradoxes. It is still the place of both union and parting, of beginnings and endings, of joy entwined with fear. The medieval chamber, with its mingling of love and loss, reminds us that mortality has always been the uninvited guest at every feast, the silent witness at every vow. The shrouded bride, then, becomes more than a strange story. She is the embodiment of a truth her world could not deny, that the chamber which welcomed her marriage was already half prepared for her funeral. And by walking into it, clothed in death's fabric, she revealed the paradox we all live with still, that to love is to risk, to create is to surrender, and to step into joy is always, inevitably, to step closer to the silence that waits for us all. The burial shroud is not just a cloth. It is a paradox stitched into fabric, a garment woven of silence and memory. In medieval Europe, to wear such a shroud was to step into a strange boundary between the living and the dead. It was a garment that had already known stillness, that had already embraced one body returning to earth, and so it carried with it a strange, fearful power. Some saw it as cursed, others as blessed. Some whispered it was dangerous to even touch it, while others clung to it as protection stronger than iron. For the bride who wrapped herself in her mother's burial cloth, it was not fashion but talisman, a fragile barrier against the darkness that stalked every womb. To understand why a shroud could be seen as protective, we must step into the medieval imagination. This was a world where cloth was never just cloth. Every thread could be infused with meaning. Relics of saints, whether bone fragments, vials of dried blood, or pieces of clothing, were believed to radiate power. Pilgrims traveled across continents to touch a cloak that had brushed a martyr's skin, or a veil once worn by a virgin saint. In this symbolic economy, fabric was more than material. It was memory, presence, a channel between mortal flesh and divine mystery. If a saint's garment could protect the living, why could not a mother's shroud, soaked in her final silence, guard her daughter from the same fate? There is something primal in this idea. We have always believed that objects which touch the body hold its essence. Locks of hair preserved in lockets, rings passed down across generations, clothes still smelling faintly of those we've lost. In these fragments we feel presence, as though the soul leaves traces behind. Medieval minds understood this instinct deeply. A shroud that had cradled a mother in her final passage was not just fabric, it was memory woven into matter, her absence pressed into its folds. To wear it was to carry her with you, to shield yourself with the weight of her life and death. But why would such a garment be seen as protection rather than curse? The logic was both strange and haunting. Death, in their eyes, could be bargained with. If the shroud had already done its work, had already carried one soul from the world, perhaps it would be satisfied, perhaps it would pass by the daughter who wore it. The shroud became like a lightning rod, drawing danger into itself so that it would not strike again. To wrap oneself in it was to say, "Death has already touched this cloth, let it not touch me." This belief was not limited to shrouds. All across Europe, there were customs where death itself was repurposed as defense. Skulls were displayed as guardians, bones carried as relics, grave soil scattered at thresholds to ward off spirits. Farmers plowed fields with tools taken from cemeteries, believing fertility could be borrowed from the dead. The line between curse and blessing was always thin, always shifting. A burial cloth could terrify or protect, depending on how it was used, depending on the story attached to it. The bride in her mother's shroud was walking within this tension. She carried a symbol that was both horror and shield. To some, she would have seemed grotesque, a living woman cloaked in the silence of the grave. To others, she would have appeared wise, protected, even blessed, carrying with her the power of her mother's memory. The whispers in the church that day would not have agreed. Some would have crossed themselves in fear. Others would have nodded in solemn recognition. All, however, would have felt the weight of the symbol. Yet the shroud was not only personal. It carried echoes of much older traditions, shadows from a pre-Christian world that refused to vanish. In ancient pagan rites, garments of the dead were often kept as charms. Tribes buried their warriors with weapons not only to arm them in the afterlife, but to protect the living tribe from being haunted. In some traditions, brides were led through graveyards, their steps watched by ancestors, as if to bind fertility with mortality. When Christianity spread, these customs did not simply disappear. They were transformed, cloaked in new prayers, baptized in new rituals, but their bones remained. The burial shroud as a talisman was part of this survival, the old mingling with the new, the pagan lurking beneath the Christian. What strikes us most today is the intimacy of such a gesture. Imagine pulling your mother's shroud around your shoulders, knowing it once carried her body into silence. Imagine the scent, faint but still lingering, of incense from her burial. Imagine the texture, rougher than bridal lace, heavier than bridal silk. Each fold a reminder of her absence, each thread a whisper of her death. To carry that into your wedding day was to carry not only protection but memory, not only survival but grief. It was to bind yourself visibly to her fate and pray that by carrying it, you might escape it. But here lies the paradox. Did it protect, or did it doom? Folklore is never unanimous. Some tales tell of brides who wore the shroud and lived long, their children safe, their households prosperous. In these versions, the shroud became a relic of victory, proof that death could be bargained with, cheated, outwitted by cloth and courage. Yet other tales tell of brides who died within months, their bodies wrapped again in the very fabric they once wore as shield. For them, the shroud became prophecy rather than protection, a cruel foreshadowing of the silence to come. The uncertainty itself is what gave the symbol its power. It could not be dismissed. It demanded awe, whether as hope or as curse. We see echoes of this psychology in all human history. We turn to objects to protect us, though they hold no power except what we give them. We clutch crosses, lockets, charms. We hang tokens from car mirrors, tie threads around our wrists, bury amulets in fields. The medieval mind was not so different from ours. The shroud was simply their most extreme expression of the same instinct, the need to make mortality tangible, and then to try to control it by touch. But there is more. The shroud was not only fabric and memory, it was philosophy. To wear it was to confront death openly, to refuse denial. In our world, we hide death behind curtains, hospitals, rituals of silence. In theirs, death was too constant to ignore. It walked in every street, it slept in every chamber, it knocked at every door. To wear a shroud was to say, I see you, death, and I will not pretend you are absent. I will walk into love with you at my side, and if you strike, you will not strike unseen. That act is both terrifying and courageous, both resignation and defiance. And so the image of the shrouded bride is not merely strange, it is profound. It is a declaration of truth in a world built on fragility. It tells us that love and death are not enemies but companions, that to embrace one is to risk the other. It tells us that even in our most joyous moments, the shadow waits, and that to acknowledge it is not despair but honesty. This is why the shroud remains in memory, why it lingers in story. It is not just about one woman in one church. It is about humanity's endless attempt to armor itself against what cannot be defeated. The shroud is every prayer we whisper before stepping into danger, every charm we clutch before taking a risk, every ritual we invent to make sense of the senseless. It is both absurd and necessary. It is both powerless and powerful. It is the paradox we all live within. And as the bride walked forward that day, the cloth trailing behind her, the whispers filling the church, she embodied that paradox. Was she blessed or cursed? Protected or doomed? Even those who watched did not know. Even we, centuries later, cannot know. All we can see is the haunting beauty of her defiance, the strange poetry of her courage. She chose to wear death as shield, to bind memory to future, to cloak herself not in silk but in silence, and in doing so, she carried the weight of a world's fear and a world's hope. The medieval world was a theater of contradictions, and nowhere was this more visible than in the perception of the female body. It was praised as sacred, condemned as dangerous. It was the vessel of life and the herald of death. To look upon a bride was to see both promise and peril. Her womb carried the possibility of lineage, inheritance, continuity. But it also carried the possibility of silence, of the grave, of a line cut short. This tension shaped the rituals that surrounded her life, binding superstition and faith around her like chains and shields. To be a woman in this age was to walk with constant scrutiny. Priests warned that the body of Eve carried the curse of sin, that pain in childbirth was not accident but punishment, written into flesh by divine decree. Yet the same sermons called women holy vessels, chosen by God to bring forth new life. The echoes of Mary's purity mingled with Eve's transgression. Between these extremes, ordinary women moved, both exalted and despised, both feared and revered. The body itself was a map of symbols. Blood was sacred and dangerous. Menstrual cycles were read as signs of impurity, yet also as signals of fertility. Conception was celebrated, but the vulnerability it demanded was feared. Childbirth was both miracle and terror, marked by prayers, midwives' chants, and relics hung above the bed. The woman's body was not her own, it was public, the property of family, of lineage, of community. In her health or failure, entire households felt their fates decided. Superstition filled the gaps where medicine could not. Amulets were worn against miscarriage. small crosses, pieces of coral, strings of herbs tied around the waist. Relics were placed near the womb to call divine protection. Some women swallowed wax droplets shaped from altar candles, believing holy fire would burn away danger inside them. Others tied iron keys around their hips to lock the womb against death's intrusion. These gestures may seem desperate, but desperation was all they had. In a world where childbirth could not be mastered, symbols became the only defense. Faith was not separate from these practices. It was interwoven. The Church blessed and condemned in equal measure. Priests denounced pagan charms, while simultaneously offering relics of saints to women in labor. Midwives whispered incantations, but they also sprinkled holy water, crossed themselves, and prayed aloud. A woman in labor might clutch a rosary in one hand while holding a talisman in the other. To modernize, it seems contradiction. To them, it was unity. All forces, divine, natural, mystical, were enlisted to protect a body constantly at war with mortality. This layering of faith and superstition also revealed the anxiety surrounding female power. Women's ability to bring forth life was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It was seen as uncontrollable, as something closer to nature than to civilization, something that blurred the line between holy and profane. Some sermons compared the womb to a battlefield where angels and demons fought for the soul of the unborn child. Others described it as a threshold to the underworld, a portal that invited spirits to linger. And so, a woman's body was never only hers. It was cosmological, the site of forces beyond comprehension. Think of the weight this placed upon the bride who wore her mother's shroud. She was not only protecting herself. She was protecting lineage, inheritance, the hopes of families, the prayers of ancestors. Her body was the vessel of the future, and so every precaution, every charm, every superstition was heaped upon her. The shroud became the most extreme symbol of this burden, an acknowledgement that her survival mattered not only for herself, but for all who depended upon her womb. But was this reverence true honor, or hidden cruelty? The question lingers. For every ritual of protection was also a reminder that her body was never safe, never free. The charms tied to her waist declared her weakness as much as her worth. The relics pressed against her belly announced the danger within as loudly as the life. To be protected was also to be imprisoned. Every ritual whispered, "You are fragile, you are cursed, you must be guarded." It was a cage dressed as a blessing. And yet, women endured. They embraced these rituals not only because they were forced upon them, but because they offered hope. To tie a charm, to whisper a prayer, to wear a shroud, these were not only acts of submission but acts of agency, small attempts to grasp control in a world that denied them power. In carrying talismans, women were carrying courage, carrying memory, carrying belief that they could survive. The very fragility of their position gave rise to extraordinary resilience. There is something profoundly moving in this. A bride who clutched her relics was not naive. She knew the risks better than anyone. Her rituals were not ignorance but strength, her way of stepping forward despite the terror. To wear a shroud was not surrender but defiance, a refusal to pretend danger did not exist. Her body might be the battlefield, but she would walk into it armed with symbols, cloaked in faith, carrying both her mother's death and her own determination in equal measure. And so the medieval world's obsession with female bodies reveals both cruelty and beauty. It was cruel to demand sacrifice, to weigh women down with the expectation of heirs, to blame them for death that was inevitable. But it was also beautiful in the way women resisted, in the way they transformed objects into shields, in the way they walked into marriage knowing the risk and yet still hoped, still loved, still prayed. The shroud, in this light, becomes not only a talisman against death, but also a testimony to resilience. It is the proof that women knew their fate, and yet still chose to face it with courage. It is the fabric of memory transformed into armor, the cloth of silence turned into a banner of survival. And it reminds us that beneath every superstition, beneath every charm, beneath every whispered prayer, there was always the beating heart of women who dared to hope in the face of fear. Marriage in the medieval world was never simply about love. It was a transaction with time itself, a gamble played with bloodlines, wealth, and survival. To marry was to plant a fragile seed into uncertain soil, hoping that it would grow into the future of a family, a dynasty, a kingdom. The bride was not only a wife, she was the vessel of continuity, the fragile bridge between past and future. Her survival in childbirth was not a private concern but the fate of entire lineages. And when she died, it was not only her life that was extinguished, but the inheritance of generations. The weight of this truth presses heavily on the story of the shrouded bride. When she walked into the church cloaked in her mother's burial cloth, she was not simply protecting herself from death, she was carrying the hopes of her entire bloodline. Every family understood this fear, that the extinction of their name, their estate, their legacy, could come not by war or famine, but by the silence of one woman's womb. Consider the dynasties that fell victim to this fragility. Royal chronicles are littered with stories of families undone by the deaths of their women. The Plantagenets of England fought bitter wars partly because heirs were scarce. The Tudors rose to power only after the fragile threads of bloodlines broke, leaving kingdoms vulnerable. Even emperors, surrounded by armies and wealth, could not command survival in childbirth. One woman's death could topple stability, redraw borders, and plunge nations into chaos. But this fear was not limited to kings. In villages and towns, inheritance determined survival just as much as in castles. A peasant family depended on children to work the fields, to care for parents in old age, to carry on the fragile thread of survival in a world of famine and plague. If a mother died and her child with her, the household's future collapsed. Land might be sold, fields abandoned, names forgotten. Extinction was not only the fate of dynasties but of ordinary families. Every marriage, every childbirth, carried within it the shadow of this possibility. And so, rituals grew heavier. The shroud on the bride's shoulders was more than personal, it was communal, a family's desperate shield against oblivion. By wrapping her in the cloth of her mother, they were not only protecting her life but guarding their own survival. If she lived, the bloodline lived. If she died, their legacy vanished with her. It was a burden almost unimaginable, yet it was one women carried as part of ordinary life. There is a cruel irony here. The very body that was revered as the vessel of life was also seen as the constant threat of extinction. Families praised daughters as the hope of lineage, but they also feared them as the weak link through which death might enter. And so, the bride was celebrated and mourned in the same breath, her wedding day both a triumph and a gamble. Behind the music and feast, there was always a shadowed awareness. Her survival was not guaranteed. Imagine the psychological weight of this knowledge. To marry was to accept not only the risks of childbirth but the responsibility for generations yet unborn. A bride's failure to live through labor could undo decades of toil, could erase names from memory, could shatter the fragile architecture of inheritance. And so, the rituals became desperate. Relics, shrouds, prayers, bargains with death disguised as symbols of faith. The body became a battlefield not only of survival but of legacy. Even the language of the time reveals this tension. Women were often described as vessels, or fields, their wombs the soil into which men planted lineage. But if the soil failed, if the field was barren or the harvest cut short, it was seen as disaster. Inheritance law was ruthless. Estates passed to distant cousins, property was seized by overlords, names disappeared from records. Death in childbirth was not only tragedy, it was legal chaos, economic collapse, historical erasure. The silence of one woman could echo across centuries. This is why we cannot dismiss the shroud as mere superstition. It was an act of survival strategy, a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. For in a world where bloodlines carried everything, property, identity, memory, the fear of extinction was the deepest fear of all. Families might endure famine or plague, but without heirs, they were erased. The bride's body became the fragile gate through which extinction could be held at bay. But let us reflect more deeply. What does it mean to place such weight upon a single body? What kind of love can flourish under such fear? To see the bride as only vessel is to deny her humanity, to reduce her to womb and survival. And yet, this was her world. Her body was not hers alone. It was the battleground of history, the altar upon which generations prayed for continuity. Her life was never simply her own, it was inheritance incarnate. Still, within this cruelty, there is a strange nobility. For these women, knowingly or not, carried history on their shoulders. Their survival was not only their triumph, but the triumph of those who came after. To live through childbirth was to defeat extinction, to secure memory, to gift the future. And in this, their suffering becomes something more than tragedy. It becomes testimony to resilience, to courage, to the strange and terrible endurance of the human spirit. The shrouded bride, then, is not only one figure in one church. She is a symbol of countless women who bore the same burden, who walked into marriage knowing they carried not only their own fate but the fate of bloodlines. She reminds us that extinction was never far, that every lineage we see today is built upon the survival of fragile bodies in fragile moments. The fact that we exist is proof that enough women survived the gamble, that enough shrouds failed to claim their wearers. And yet, the story carries unease. For while we may honor their endurance, we must not forget the cruelty of the system that demanded it. Women were not given choice. Their survival was demanded, their deaths accepted, their bodies treated as vessels for others' legacies. The shroud may have been worn as talisman, but it was also chain. It was protection and prison both. It was hope and burden woven together. Perhaps this is why the image lingers with such force. Because it is not only about one woman, one family, one shroud. It is about the universal fear of extinction, the terror of memory erased, the fragility of inheritance. It is about our desperate attempts to bind ourselves to the future, to keep our names alive, to cheat the silence of history. And in the shrouded bride, we see both the cruelty of that burden and the courage with which it was borne. The medieval world was a place where death was constant, but so too was resistance. Against plagues, against famine, against childbirth, against the invisible terrors that stalked every household, people armed themselves not with steel alone but with ritual. Every act of faith, every superstition, every fragment of charm was a rebellion, a whispered defiance against inevitability. To live was to resist, and to resist was to surround oneself with symbols of protection. For the bride in her mother's burial shroud, the act was not singular, it was part of a much larger pattern of resistance. Across villages and kingdoms, women entered marriage armed with tokens, prayers, and practices meant to outwit death. It was a battle fought not in fields with armies, but in chambers with candles, herbs, and cloth. The body itself was the battlefield, and rituals became the weapons. Consider the relics of saints. Bones enshrined in silver, fragments of cloth said to have touched martyrs, drops of oil drawn from holy lamps. These were carried into wedding chambers, pressed into hands during childbirth, hung over beds as protection. In some households, the very sheets upon which a bride lay were sprinkled with water from holy springs, blessed to ward away the shadow of death. Every gesture was small, almost fragile, but together they formed a shield of meaning, a fortress of hope against the inevitable. Other practices leaned into the strangeness of superstition. Women wore iron keys around their waists to lock death out of their wombs. Midwives placed knives beneath pillows, believing sharp edges could frighten away unseen spirits. Herbs were scattered across thresholds, rosemary for memory, sage for endurance, rue for protection. Some families led brides through cemeteries before weddings, forcing them to walk among graves so that death might be satisfied with silence and leave the new life untouched. Absurd? Perhaps. But to those who lived in constant fear, no act was too small, no symbol too strange. The rituals were not only for brides. Whole communities participated. Neighbors prayed aloud, lit candles, offered charms. In certain towns, bells rang at odd hours to ward away demons said to prey on mothers in labor. Some villages staged mock battles with effigies of death, burning them to ash in the town square as if the flames could purify the air. These public rituals gave form to collective fear, transforming anxiety into action, turning despair into solidarity. Yet, for all their strangeness, these rituals carried psychological power. They gave people the illusion of control in a world where control was impossible. A woman who entered labor clutching a relic may not have been safer in body, but she was steadier in spirit. A family that dressed a bride in a shroud may not have changed her fate, but they transformed fear into a visible act of defiance. Rituals did not always protect lives, but they protected minds, giving courage in the face of terror. Philosophers of the time wrestled with these contradictions. Some condemned charms as heresy, others defended them as acts of faith. Thomas Aquinas himself reflected on the blurred line between superstition and devotion, recognizing that for ordinary people, such gestures were survival. To sprinkle holy water over a bed may have seemed irrational, but in a world where death was everywhere, it was also profoundly rational, because it gave people hope, and hope itself was medicine. There are haunting examples preserved in chronicles. A bride in France, wrapped in her mother's veil, carried into her chamber a small figurine carved from bone, said to belong to her grandmother. She clutched it through the night, whispering prayers that her womb would bear life and not silence. In Italy, some women were given tiny mirrors to wear around their necks, reflecting death away from their faces. In Germany, whole wedding processions detoured through graveyards, binding fertility to mortality in a single walk. Everywhere, rituals sprouted like wildflowers, strange and varied, yet bound by the same soil of fear. What strikes us is not the diversity of these rituals, but their persistence. Across centuries, across cultures, humans have invented countless ways to resist death through symbol. Even today, we carry echoes of these medieval acts. We hang protective charms in homes, tie threads on wrists, keep photographs of loved ones as if their presence lingers in the image. We touch wood, cross fingers, make wishes on stars. Our rituals may seem lighter, but they are born of the same need, to resist the unknown, to soften the terror of mortality. And yet, the medieval rituals carry a weight we can scarcely comprehend. For them, the danger was not abstract. It was constant, personal, immediate. A bride might be dead within a year, her child buried with her. A mother might not live to hold the infant she bore. Every ritual was carved out of necessity, every charm forged in the furnace of fear. To dismiss them as superstition is to ignore their humanity. These were acts of courage disguised as symbols, desperate attempts to build meaning in a world governed by loss. Imagine again the shrouded bride. She was not only wearing her mother's death, she was wearing her family's hope, her community's ritual, her culture's defiance. To outsiders, it may have seemed grotesque. To those who knew the fear, it was profoundly logical. Death was relentless, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be tricked, delayed, bargained with. The shroud was a wager made visible, a ritual of resistance stitched into linen. There is something strangely beautiful in this defiance. For even as they accepted death's inevitability, medieval people refused to bow to it in silence. They fought back, not with swords, but with symbols. They resisted, not by denying mortality, but by naming it, dressing it, and transforming it into ritual. Their courage was not in overcoming death, but in facing it with eyes open, hearts steady, and hands clutching whatever tokens they could find. And so, these rituals remind us of something profound, that resistance is not always victory, but it is always meaning. To resist is to declare that life matters, that memory matters, that love matters, even when death cannot be stopped. The medieval world, draped in shrouds and charms, teaches us that our defiance is itself a form of survival. The bride who wore her mother's shroud was not surrendering. She was fighting, wrapped in cloth, carrying rituals of resistance into the chamber where love and death would meet. The shrouded bride may seem to us like an isolated horror, a single fragment of medieval superstition, but she is in truth the echo of something far older. Her story is not born in the Middle Ages alone. It is woven from threads that stretch back through centuries, through pagan rites, ancestral customs, and rituals that bound life and death together long before churches and priests gave their blessings. The burial cloth as talisman, the wedding touched by the grave, the union haunted by silence. These are not inventions of medieval fear but inheritances, ancient memories dressed in new garments. For across the ancient world, love and death were never strangers. They walked side by side in myth and ritual. Fertility was celebrated in fields sown with bones, in festivals that mocked death with laughter, in ceremonies where brides and grooms were led among graves so that ancestors might witness their vows. To join two bodies in union was not only about pleasure or continuity, It was about acknowledging that new life always rose from decay, that creation was born of dissolution, that every beginning already carried its ending. Take the Roman festival of Parentalia, when families gathered in cemeteries to share meals with the dead, pouring wine into graves as offerings. Life and death mingled at the same table. Or the Celtic Samhain, where veils between worlds thinned, where fertility rites and funeral fires burned side by side. Even the Greeks, whose myths shaped so much of Europe's imagination, spoke of Persephone, bride of both spring and death, claimed by the underworld yet celebrated as goddess of rebirth. In all these echoes, we find the same haunting paradox, that love and lineage were inseparable from mortality, that marriage itself was never free of the grave's shadow. When Christianity spread across Europe, it absorbed these older traditions, baptizing them in new words, cloaking them in new meanings. But the bones of the old rituals remained. Processions through graveyards continued, now framed as pilgrimages. Offerings to ancestors became prayers to saints. The shroud once kept as a charm became a relic blessed in church. Beneath the Christian hymns, the pagan rhythms still pulsed, whispering that death and fertility were bound, that every union must pay homage to the silence that waits beyond. This explains why the burial shroud could be both horror and protection. In pagan thought, objects touched by death carried power, not pollution. A skull could guard a household. Ashes of the dead could fertilize soil. Clothing from the grave could shield the living. When Christianity labeled death as corruption, these beliefs did not vanish, they simply shifted. Families still clung to shrouds, not because priests commanded it, but because memory and instinct told them it mattered. To wear the cloth of the dead was to bind oneself to the strength of ancestors, to weave continuity through silence. There were even festivals where this truth was celebrated openly. The danse macabre, dances of skeletons painted on church walls, performed in village squares, reminded all that life and death danced together, hand in hand. In some regions, brides and grooms joined these dances as part of their wedding rites, mocking mortality even as they acknowledged it. Skeletons were not only terror, they were partners, reminders, companions. To live was to dance with death, to embrace it rather than deny it. The shrouded bride belongs to this tradition. She did not invent her ritual, she inherited it, whether she knew it or not. By wearing her mother's burial cloth, she was partaking in a pattern as old as humanity, the binding of love and death, fertility and decay, in one act of defiance. She was echoing the ancient truth that life is always born from death, that continuity is forged from endings, that to walk toward love is always to walk through the graveyard first. But why do such echoes endure? Why do we still tell her story, centuries later? Perhaps because these rituals give form to the truth we still feel but rarely admit, that mortality haunts every celebration. Weddings speak of forever, yet forever is a word death denies. To dress a bride in a shroud is to strip away illusion, to say openly what we all know secretly, that no vow escapes the silence waiting beyond. Pagan rites and medieval customs alike sought to make peace with this truth, to transform dread into ritual, terror into symbol, fear into meaning. And so, the image of the shrouded bride is not grotesque, it is profoundly human. She is the echo of skeleton dances, of feasts with ancestors, of brides led among graves. She is Persephone in another guise, both bride of love and bride of death. She is the living proof that humanity has always tried to reconcile opposites, to bind joy and grief, creation and destruction, eros and thanatos, in one fragile fabric. To dismiss her as superstition is to miss her meaning. She is the vessel of ancient wisdom, the reminder that love is never free of death, that every embrace carries its ending, that every beginning is shadowed by silence. Her shroud is not only medieval linen, it is the thread that binds us back to the first rituals of humanity, to the first fires lit in darkness, to the first prayers whispered over graves. And perhaps that is why we feel her story so deeply still. Because beneath the surface of modern weddings, beneath the white lace and golden rings, the echoes remain. We no longer wear shrouds, but we still carry the same fear, the same defiance, the same longing to bind ourselves against extinction. We still dance with death, though we pretend not to see it. The shrouded bride shows us what we have forgotten, that to deny death is to deny love itself, for one cannot exist without the other. Stories like hers do not end cleanly. They fracture, multiply, dissolve into whispers and contradictions, so that centuries later we are left not with certainty, but with possibilities. The bride who wore her mother's burial shroud has no single ending. Some say she lived long, her children carrying her name into generations. Others say she died in her first labor, her body wrapped once more in the very cloth she had worn as armor. Her fate remains suspended, half hidden in folklore, half buried in silence. And perhaps that is why she haunts us so deeply, because the uncertainty itself is part of the terror. Let us imagine the first telling, the hopeful one. The story says that she survived, that death turned its gaze away. Her wedding chamber filled not with silence but with the cries of a newborn. The shroud was folded and locked away, a relic of victory, a proof that death could be resisted. She grew old, her children surrounding her, the shroud kept as a symbol of salvation. In this version, the cloth was not curse but shield, not prophecy but miracle. Families told the tale as reassurance. Where the shroud and live, carry memory and survive. It became a charm woven into legend, a story to soothe the fearful and encourage the desperate. But there is another telling, darker, heavier, whispered more often in corners than in celebrations. In this version, the shroud did not protect her. It foretold her fate. Within months of her wedding, she labored and bled, her cries filling the chamber until they ceased altogether. The shroud she had worn as talisman was wrapped around her once more, now not as symbol but as necessity. She joined her mother in silence, their stories entwined, their cloth carrying the weight of 2 generations of death. In this version, the shroud is not armor but curse, not defiance but prophecy fulfilled. Families told this tale as warning. Death cannot be cheated, fate cannot be denied. Between these 2 tellings, her figure flickers, alive in one, gone in another. And perhaps the truth is not in choosing, but in recognizing the power of both. For every bride who survived, there was another who did not. Every shroud could be both shield and curse. The story of her fate mirrors the uncertainty of life itself, where survival and death are always poised together, separated by only a thread. Consider how this uncertainty shaped memory. Villagers who saw her on her wedding day would have told and retold the tale. Some insisted they remembered her laughter in old age, her children playing by her side. Others swore they remembered her funeral, the church bells tolling, the shroud folded once more. Over time, memory blurred, and the story became less about her individual life and more about what she represented. She became symbol rather than person, lesson rather than memory. Her fate was both, because she stood for all women, all brides, all mothers, who walked the same path into uncertainty. And perhaps this is the deeper truth. Her story is not meant to resolve. It is meant to hold us in tension, to remind us that life never offers certainty, that every step forward is a step into shadow. The shroud, whether it saved her or doomed her, is not about outcome but about awareness. It is the visible sign that death was always near, that love and mortality were always intertwined. Her fate, then, is not the question. The question is what her story teaches us about the fragile balance we all walk. Still, let us linger with the image of her final days, whether they were many or few. If she survived, imagine her in old age, her hands wrinkled, her children grown, the shroud folded at the bottom of a chest. Did she ever dare to touch it again? Did she unfold it, remembering her mother, remembering the silence of the church on her wedding day? Did she feel gratitude, or fear, or both? Perhaps she refused to speak of it, as though naming it might awaken its power once more. Perhaps she told her daughters to avoid such rituals, or perhaps she passed it on, the fabric growing heavier with memory. And if she did not survive, imagine the chamber darkened by candles, her body wrapped once more, the shroud now completing its circle. The whispers of the villagers would have carried sorrow but also inevitability. The cloth had foretold this, the ritual had not worked, death had claimed what was always its own. Her story then became tragedy, her name remembered in mourning, her tale told to warn others. The shroud became not protection but curse, a symbol of futility, a reminder that rituals cannot always bargain with fate. Whichever version we choose, the ending is never simple. For the shrouded bride is no longer only herself. She is myth, she is mirror, she is symbol of every woman who risked death in the name of life. Her fate is the fate of many, her uncertainty the uncertainty of all. To seek clarity is to miss the point. The story lingers because it refuses clarity, because it keeps us suspended in the paradox that defined medieval life. That every joy carried grief, that every vow carried risk, that every beginning was already shadowed by its ending. And perhaps this is why the tale survived when so many others did not. Because it forces us to face questions we still avoid. Can death be bargained with? Can rituals protect us? Is fate fixed, or can it be swayed by courage, by memory, by cloth? The Shrouded Bride asks us to confront these questions, knowing we will not find answers. Her fate is both survival and death, both miracle and tragedy, both hope and despair. She is all outcomes at once, because life itself is all outcomes at once. So when we ask what happened to her, we are really asking what happens to us. Do our own rituals protect us? Do our own charms delay the inevitable? Or are we, like her, walking forward clothed in illusions, comforted by symbols even as fate waits unmoved? These questions echo across centuries, from her silent church to our quiet hearts. We do not know her fate, and perhaps we do not want to. For to leave it unresolved is to honor the mystery of life itself. The shroud remains, heavy with memory, heavy with possibility. Folded, it carries silence. Worn, it carries defiance. In life, it might protect. In death, it might prophesy. It is both blessing and curse, both armor and chain. And the bride who wore it is forever suspended in that duality, walking endlessly down the aisle, stepping endlessly into the chamber, her fate forever uncertain, her story forever echoing. The story of the bride who wore her mother's burial shroud is not simply history, it is reflection. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of all human life, to the paradoxes that bind us across centuries. For her, the shroud was both armor and omen, both blessing and curse. For us, it becomes something more, a symbol of the endless human struggle to face mortality, to resist extinction, to weave meaning into the silence that waits beyond. We have walked with her through the chamber of weddings and funerals, through the cries of childbirth and the tolling of bells, through the rituals of resistance and the echoes of ancient rites. We have seen how her story is not only her own but the story of a world that lived in constant shadow, where every embrace was fragile, where every promise was haunted. And now, as we reach the end of this journey, we must pause to reflect on what her shroud reveals about us. The first truth is that death was never hidden in her world. It was not softened, not sanitized. It stood openly at the altar, walked into the chamber, sat beside the bed. By wearing the shroud, she did not pretend otherwise, she acknowledged it. And in that acknowledgement, there is a strange kind of wisdom. For while we hide death today, cloak it in hospitals and silence, it still waits as faithfully as it did then. Her shroud reminds us that honesty about mortality is not despair, but courage. The second truth is that love and death are not enemies, but companions. To love is always to risk loss, to bring life is always to invite silence. The medieval mind did not try to separate them, they placed them side by side, in ritual, in song, in story. The Shrouded Bride embodies this unity. Her wedding day was already half a funeral, her veil already a winding cloth, her vows already shadowed by mortality. Yet still she walked forward. That courage is not foreign to us, it is the courage of every parent, every lover, every human who dares to hope in the face of inevitable loss. The third truth is that rituals, however strange, are not foolish, they are human. To tie an iron key around the waist, to wear a charm, to walk through a graveyard, to wear a shroud, these were not delusions, but acts of resistance. They gave meaning where none existed, hope where none was promised. Even today, we cling to our own rituals. We light candles for the dead, we carry photographs of those we've lost, we make silent wishes on falling stars. The forms change, but the need remains the same. The Shrouded Bride is not so distant from us after all. And the final truth is this: extinction was always the fear beneath the fear. Families did not only dread the death of a daughter or a mother. They dreaded the vanishing of names, the erasure of bloodlines, the silence of inheritance. The shroud was not only personal armor, it was a shield for memory, for lineage, for the fragile hope that life would continue. That fear is not gone. Even now, we seek to leave something behind: children, art, words, legacies, anything to keep the silence from swallowing us whole. So what do we see when we look into her shroud? We see ourselves. We see our own fragile rituals, our own desperate hopes, our own paradoxes. We may no longer drape brides in burial cloth, but we carry other shrouds: denial, distraction, the illusions of permanence. We pretend forever is within reach, even as we know it is not. Her shroud tears that illusion away, reminding us that to live is to carry death, that to love is to risk grief, that to be human is to walk always with shadow. Yet, this is not despair. It is illumination. For when we accept the shadow, life becomes sharper, clearer, more profound. The shrouded bride teaches us that meaning is not found in escaping mortality, but in embracing it. By wearing death on her wedding day, she revealed a truth too often forgotten: that joy is only precious because it ends, that love is only powerful because it risks loss, that life is only sacred because it is fragile. And so, as her image fades from our sight, let it linger in our hearts. See her walking down the aisle, pale cloth trailing, whispers rising, eyes steady. See her entering the chamber, carrying both love and death upon her shoulders. See her fate, uncertain, unresolved, forever suspended between survival and silence. She is more than one woman. She is all of us. She is humanity clothed in paradox, daring to hope while knowing the cost, daring to love while knowing the risk, daring to live while carrying the shroud. Her story does not end with her. It ends with us, with the questions we must carry forward. What shrouds do we wear today? What rituals do we cling to, hoping to shield ourselves from the inevitable? And when our time comes, will we meet death clothed in denial, or will we, like her, have the courage to walk forward wearing its fabric openly? The bells of her church are long silent, the whispers of her village long faded. Yet the echo remains, carried across centuries, into our lives, into our hearts. The bride in the shroud still walks, and in her steps we see the truth of our own: that to be human is to be fragile, to be vulnerable, to be mortal, and that in the very fragility lies the beauty of our existence.